Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I think it's now 7:30, and welcome to Berwick Parish Church and the Parish Centre in particular, and to this talk by Professor John Barton on the King James Version of the Bible. My name is Philip Moore, and I chair the Parish Church Trust, which is associated with the parish church here. The Trust, incidentally, is the body which helps to fund the maintenance of the parish church and indeed other aspects of the church's activities, including the parish centre here. But of course, while the Trust can help with many of the activities of the church, having a Grade 1 listed building of national significance here is a major commitment and responsibility. And I hope that you will take away the leaflet which you found on your seats when you came and read it. I hope that you'll think of the Trust as a worthy potential recipient of your largesse from time to time, if you have any largesse left at the moment. And I know not many people have. Professor Barton, who will be speaking to us in a moment, is of course, he intended to give his talk here in person in the church. But as you'll have gathered from the greeting you were given when you arrived, very sadly, his wife, who has been ill for some time, was taken seriously ill at the beginning of this week. And understandably, in the circumstances, he didn't feel that he could stray far from home. And hence, we've made arrangements. I'm grateful to David and helpers from the Maltings Theatre and so on for this. We made arrangements for Professor Barton to deliver his talk via Zoom tonight. I know that we'll all wish John Barton and Mary, his wife, the very best, and they'll be the subject of our prayers at this challenging time for them both. It's great that John can still speak to us, even if not quite as was originally envisaged. I just want to add that after his talk, there will be opportunity for questions and answers. And Stephen Platten is going to chair the proceedings. When the proceedings close, there'll be a vote of thanks given by Andrew Duco, who's sitting at the back there, who is the director of Berwick's Literary Festival. And we've been very grateful indeed for the opportunity to do this, make this arrangement for this talk in conjunction with the Literary Festival, which has gone on from strength to strength over recent years. This talk on the King James Version of the Bible is the parish church's contribution to the Berwick Bridge 400 series of events, which Margaret Shaw, who's the vice chair of the Trust, in fact, and others, she's chairing a group which is working up the programme of activities to mark the 400th anniversary of the opening of Berwick's Old Bridge. Of course, the link between that and tonight's talk is King James VI and First, the instigator of both enterprises, if you like. But more about his part and so on in proceedings, I'm sure John will tell us very shortly.
Thank you very much, Philip, and I'll add my welcome to all of you. It's a delight to see you all here. It's a particular delight to be chairing and introducing Professor John Barton. He and I have known each other, as we were just reminiscing, for a very long time indeed, right the way back to when I was a curate in Headington in Oxford. And we've kept in touch through various things over the years, but it's a delight that you're here, John, albeit by this means. And I'm just brandishing a book from the air called The Word, which is, if it's not your latest book, it's certainly near enough your latest book, I think. And it's the subtitle is On the Translation of the Bible. John is one of the most distinguished biblical scholars and theologians writing and teaching still today, not just nationally, but internationally. He was the Oriel and Lang Professor in the University of Oxford and a fellow of Oriel College. And he's been a fellow of the British Academy for many years now. But he's also a priest and has assisted at Abingdon, his home church, and variously in other ways in the Diocese of Oxford, at one point as chaplain of St. Cross College. And he was, I don't think at the same time that Philip was doing the job, he was there on General Synod, he was on the General Synod. So there's something that he may have to, include in his penitential rite next time. Perhaps it's worth just saying that something, I think, of the inspiration behind John's work over these years comes from him being, alongside John Muddiman, another great scholar, the last two, I think, tutorial partners taught by Austin Farrer. And Farrer has been said by a number of different people, including Rowan Williams, so it must be right, that he is one of the most, perhaps the most creative Anglican scholar of the 20th century. And certainly I know John would see him as a great inspiration. John's written, I think, I'm not very good at counting, but either 19 or 20 books as sole author. He's written on the Old Testament prophets, on the canon, and on interpretation of the Bible. And he and John Muddiman put together a very useful book indeed, the Oxford Bible Commentary. Perhaps one of the most extraordinary achievements was that for a number of weeks, 4 or 5 years ago, when his History of the Bible was published, it was the top top of the hit parade, as it were, in the Times non-fiction category, which is a remarkable achievement. That doesn't often happen nowadays with theological books. So that's a great thing in itself. And since then, the Word has been published too. I'm not going to waste any more time because you come here to listen to John and not to me talking about John. So, John, we're delighted that we're about to hear you. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you for that. Those introductory comments. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak. I'm very sorry I'm not physically present, but you understand why. But I'm very grateful that at the last minute, as it were, arrangements were made for me to talk through Zoom, whereas some years ago, perhaps before the pandemic, wouldn't have occurred to us we could do this. But now it's become more common, and it's certainly a relief to me to be able to stay at home just at the moment. I'm very sorry not to be with you for my own sake too, because I've never been to Berwick. I've only ever been past it, which is very sad, and I would very much like to have been there. I live in Abingdon, just south of Oxford, which is a town of the same sort of size, also with a fine medieval church, and I wish I could be there to see yours. I'm sorry I can't. So my lecture is called, or talk is called, Authorized and Unauthorized Versions, Bridges or Barriers, the King James Bible and its modern successors. It's a strange fact, though people don't usually stop to think about it much, that almost everyone in the world who reads the Bible is reading a translation. The Old Testament was written in Hebrew, plus a few chapters in Aramaic, which is a related language, both of which are Semitic languages related also to Arabic. Some Jews, of course, can read the Old Testament in Hebrew, but otherwise it's really only theologians, some rabbis, some clergy, and students who get to read Hebrew at all. The New Testament was written in a form of ancient Greek. Modern Greeks can just about read it, much as some English speakers can just about read Chaucer. It's a sort of distant from them, but it's still in the same, recognizably the same language. But again, otherwise, only scholars and students on the whole read the New Testament in Greek. So translation is essential in almost the whole world. If you read the Bible, you read a translation. And as we celebrate the translation of the Bible that was commissioned by King James the Sixth and First, or First and Sixth, depending on your point of view, it's good to start by reflecting that if it wasn't for those who have mastered the biblical languages, most Christians would have no access at all to these foundation documents of Christianity and Judaism. But the members of the three companies of translators, as they were called, assembled by King James in London, Oxford, and Cambridge, were clearly expert in these and many other ancient and modern languages. Most of them were fantastically good linguists. They produced a version so successful that many in the English-speaking world still regard it as absolutely normative. Indeed, so successful was it that some people have never really grasped that it is a translation at all. When we celebrated the 400th anniversary of the King James Bible in 2011, there were many articles in the paper and so on about how great it is. And some of the praise it attracted gave the impression that memorable phrases in it had actually been crafted from scratch by King James's translators, rather than being translations. So that, for example, "let there be light," I saw someone saying, we owe that phrase to King James's translators. Well, in a certain sense, that's true. But of course, the phrase it was the translation of, Yehi or in Hebrew, was written by a Hebrew scribe maybe 2,500 years ago. And we owe it to him perhaps a bit more than we owe it to King James's translators. Not to diminish them, but to say they were translators. They didn't invent the Bible, and the Bible isn't a 17th century creation, but something much older. Well, today we're juxtaposing a celebration of the King James Bible with the 400th anniversary of your bridge in Berwick, simply because both happen to have been set in train, or blessed, as it were, by the same person, this quirky but brilliant Scottish king, who was perhaps the most intelligent person ever to have sat on the throne of England, unless that was his predecessor, Elizabeth I. There isn't any obvious connection between the bridge and the King James Bible, yet both do derive in different ways from James's concern to unify his two kingdoms of Scotland and England, to unify the warring factions in the church, and to unify the two sides of the river in Berwick. And it isn't too contrived to say that translation, especially translation of significant and weighty works, such as the Bible, is also an exercise in, metaphorically speaking, bridge building. On one side of the river stands what translators call the source, the piece of writing in its own language and culture, in its own ways of thinking, in its characteristic style, its original social context. All those constitute the text we want to translate, in this case, the Bible. On the other side of the river is what's called the target, the culture and language we want to translate this text into. And we want to translate it so well that in the target language, the language we're going into, it conveys the same meaning that was originally expressed in the source language. That's always what we're trying to do in translation, as anyone knows who tries to use a phrase book to communicate in another country. It's as true of translating the Bible, a religiously high-flying piece of world-class literature, as it is of producing an English version of the Chinese instructions for building a self-assembly cupboard. In both cases, the translator has to get the text successfully across the river from its original home into a new one. And the translator must neither, on the one hand, allow bits to drop off by artificially oversimplifying the original, nor, on the other hand, permit embellishments that may look like improvements, but really falsify the original meaning or tone. As Dr. Johnson remarked, a translator is to be like his author. it is not his business to excel him. The translator mustn't make the text better than it was to start with. Translation is a humble task, rather like the self-effacing job of an accompanist in music. And the translator is a servant of two masters, the original text and the target setting in a new language. But he's not there to practice any kind of self-promotion. What translators are aiming at is equivalence between the text and the translation. In getting the biblical, or indeed any text, from the source side of the river to the target side, the ideal will always be to make the translation an exact equivalent of the original. When we read the New Testament and we read it in translation, we want to read precisely what Jesus said, precisely what Luke described, precisely what St. Paul argued. We just want to hear that in our own language. Surely not much to ask, given that there are learned people who know Hebrew and Greek. Well, I'm sorry to have to say that for Bible translators, just as for anyone translating anything, this simple and apparently modest requirement is in reality so difficult that it can never be completely achieved. Even King James's panels didn't achieve it, not because they weren't good enough, but because it's inherently unattainable. Obviously, you might say there can be an infinite number of ways you can mistranslate any piece of writing, all the way up to directly contradicting what it says. What many people don't see is that there's also an infinite number of ways you can translate correctly. Yet, at the same time, no one translation is or can, even in principle, be the right one. To repeat the point, this isn't because all translators are fallible or imperfect and are bound to make mistakes, true enough though that is. It's that the perfect translation of any piece of writing could not exist even in an ideal world, because the whole idea is incoherent. I'm not saying this to diminish the excellence of the King James Bible, or to imply that one translation is as good as another. But I do want to tease out what's really involved in translation, which is more complicated than you might imagine if you've never tried your hand at it. And it involves more than simply knowing the two languages concerned, and it can be done well or badly, but it can never be done absolutely perfectly. Knowledge of the languages is a prerequisite, but there's so much more besides. If we want to translate any sentence from one language into another, we face the same problem as we do in understanding a sentence in our own language uttered by someone else. How to get the idea that's in their mind into our mind without distorting it. Now, naturally, in translation, a bilingual dictionary can help. Dictionary entries of words in another language with the English equivalent will play a role. But of course, apparently equivalent words often have different overtones in the different cultural context in which the two languages are spoken. For example, there's no way of translating fish and chip shop into French that conveys all the overtones it has for most British people. The obvious problem underlying the difficulty in a case like this applies less obviously to all translation without exception, even when the words used look like real equivalents. The history of Bible translation shows it with special clarity, since the Bible comes from a world, or more than one world, very clearly different from ours. The essence of the problem is that the language, the social setting, and the attitudes that are taken for granted in the source, in the piece of writing that's being translated, aren't the same as those in the target, the system of speech and writing and culture that it's being translated into. The translator is constantly performing a balancing act, veering between being true to the source and being true to the target, and never quite doing justice to either. Loyalty to the source, to the original text of the Bible, will produce a translation that may sound a bit foreign and peculiar in the target language and its culture. However you translate fish and chip shop, it's never going to sound really French because it's not a French phenomenon. You'll end up with a translation from which you could reconstruct the original English. You'll know it must have been an English piece in origin. And although it will be in a sense accurate, in that it'll tell you that we're talking about a shop that sells fried fish and chipped potatoes, it won't sound or feel like real French, the kind of thing a French person would write. Since the original did sound like real English, then in that sense, the translation isn't accurate because it makes what was a normal English expression into a rather abnormal French one. At one level, it conveys the basic information, but the tone and the style and the background associations get lost or distorted. But there's equally a problem if you're loyal to the target, to the language you're translating into. That will produce a piece of English that is readable and natural, but one that loses its anchorage in the original context in order to sound natural in the target culture. For example, if you look at the French translations of Harry Potter, which I stress I don't do all the time, but I have done, you will find a steak and kidney pudding being mentioned. But that becomes, in the French translation, slices of roast beef. And a number of people objected strongly to this. They said that's not what the original says. But the point is, French readers would have no idea what steak and kidney pudding was if it was translated literally, or more important, what place it occupies in the hearts of many British people. Whereas they would get some of that sense, some of the right vibes from roast beef, traditionally regarded in France as stereotypically English food. The source, the literal meaning of the source text, is sacrificed to the target to produce a readable translation. By not sticking closely to the original wording, paradoxically, the translation gives the French reader a more accurate impression of the original text than a more literal rendering would do. Now, any translator has to negotiate problems of this kind. There are translators of the Bible who don't seem even aware of them. And there are some who are aware of them and think they can solve them, but there are just a few who know that the problem can't be solved, but through a kind of genius, manage to produce a stable compromise. And that is why the King James Bible is such a great work. It manages to be both a window into the original text in Hebrew and Greek, and yet at the same time, a monument of 17th century English. Not solving the insoluble problem, but negotiating it more skillfully than most other versions then or now. But a sober assessment won't claim for it a perfection or unique excellence, because translation is always a compromise, and it can't by definition ever be a perfect one. You can't get exactly the middle point between being true to the original source and true to the target language. It does, however, the King James Bible, pull off a rather special trick that's achieved only by the very greatest translations of anything, and I'll try and show that later. Well, here's the dilemma for translators, how to be loyal to the text and yet loyal to the culture they're translating it into. And there's a classic statement of this dilemma in the writings of the philosopher and theologian Friedrich Schleiermacher. In a lecture in 1813, he summed it up like this: either the translator leaves the writer as far as possible in peace and moves the reader towards him, or else he leaves the reader as far as possible in peace and moves the writer towards him. The translator has a choice among the lines I've been describing. Moving the reader towards the writer means recognizing that the writer has said things or described things in a way that makes sense in the usages of his or her own language and culture, and feeling that the job of the translator is to produce a version in English that preserves this awareness that the text is saying strange things from a different culture, and that to signal by the translation that in reading this piece of writing, we're entering a world that isn't quite ours, where things are said a bit differently. And so in a translation of the Bible like that, characters will speak, of course, in intelligible English, but in a different way from people today, so that we can feel that this is an ancient book from a rather different world. The translation will remain a bridge between cultures. When we get to the other side, we encounter a barrier, a kind of passport control that reminds us that we're entering foreign territory and should be prepared for surprises. That the text doesn't say just what we would have said, but something strange which we've got to stretch our minds to understand. And the translation, because it's in unfamiliar language, conveys that sort of feeling. Most Bible readers have had that feeling, for example, when they read the King James Version. When St. Paul is telling us, what St. Paul is telling us may be inspired by God, may be eternally true, but his way of putting it is strange to our ways of thinking and speaking. Paul didn't speak just as you or I might do. He spoke in a way that to us is unusual. A translation that evens all that out doesn't quite do Paul justice. If we believe in moving the reader towards the writer in that sense, we'll want the writer's way of putting things to show through the translation and to sound slightly strange to modern ears. The way dialogue does in a good historical novel, for example, where you don't feel that you can't understand what people are saying, but you recognize that they're not talking just as we would now, and capturing that the right degree of distance makes writing historical novels very difficult. And you can end up with them saying, tally ho, and all sorts of rather strange antique things. Or you can get them speaking in modern idioms in a way that people say, well, nobody would have said that in those days. And you have to somehow work between those two things. We may feel, therefore, that the translation of a sentence of the Bible should read as much like Hebrew or Greek as the English version can make it do to capture the sense of foreignness. And the King James Bible does this a lot, which is why we all recognize what we call biblical English when we hear it. The style mimics the original underlying Hebrew or Greek, especially the underlying Hebrew in the Old Testament. Think, for example, of all the verses in the Old Testament that in the King James Bible begin, and it came to pass that such and such happened. Now, that isn't everyday English in normal speech, but it signals and tells you that there's a special way in Hebrew of moving to the next event, which is to have a phrase that you don't really need in English, which says, and it happened that, rather than just then. Sometimes this kind of translation, which is quite literal, is called in translators' technical jargon formal equivalence. In other words, the words are the same on the formal level. They have the same form, the same order, the same way of doing things. Now, by contrast, moving the writer towards the reader operates with an approach to translation that's often favored by translators of the Bible into English nowadays. Rather than working word by word and trying to retain the sense that the Bible is a bit alien, it looks for the most natural way of saying in English what the translator thinks a section is trying to convey. And it converges on what would be called paraphrase, where you take the meaning and spell it out in your own words. So you can't find a word that corresponds to a word in the original, but you can say the whole passage says the same thing in a sense as the original does. The extreme case of this is a version called The Message by Eugene Peterson, which is a marvelous retelling of the Bible, in effect, in his own words. it's a sort of rewrite rather than what most people would call a translation. And in technical jargon, this approach is known as functional equivalence. You produce a piece of English which works in the same way as the original did in Hebrew or Greek. We ask what the writer was trying to convey, and then we ask, how would we phrase that nowadays if we were trying to get those ideas across? Now, many modern Bibles work in this way. For example, the Jerusalem Bible and its recent revisions, or the New English Bible, which many people here will have encountered. With those, you don't say, how do they translate this word? Because they may not have done so. What they've done is to take a whole passage and say, let's imagine that in modern English, and then write what that would produce. When the translators encounter an alien sounding idiom, they ask, how would we say that kind of thing nowadays? Rather than following the rather foreign sounding wording of the source text. For example, where the King James Bible calls the people of God the children of Israel, exactly as the Hebrew does, modern versions recognize that that phrase nowadays would normally be expressed by saying the Israelites, and so they translate it accordingly. It loses there, of course, the implication that they're all descended from someone called Israel, which they are according to Genesis, but it's much nearer to normal modern English. And a particularly striking example of this way of translating is Tom Wright's The New Testament for Everyone. Tom Wright, people will remember, perhaps was Bishop of Durham for some years. He's a Northumbrian, you'll be pleased to know. He was a colleague of mine in Oxford for many years, so I know him very well. And he produced the New Testament for Everyone, which makes St. Paul, for example, sound like a modern theology lecturer. He talks in the way you would if you were having a sort of seminar in theology. In fact, you could say his letters end up sounding as if they were written by Tom Wright in the first place. But that's not necessarily a criticism, because it reminds us that in his own day, Paul was modern and he was giving, as it were, lectures about theology to his churches. He wasn't talking in an archaic way in his own day, but in what then was a modern day. And versions like Tom Wright's communicate freshly and remind us that the first readers encountered Paul as speaking in their now, talking in the language of the moment, not as if he was setting out to write a chapter of the King James Bible. So the way of translating into English, which takes the whole passage and reconceptualizes it in modern English, is also valid. It is possible to go a bit too far with this approach and slip from being current and fresh to being so colloquial that the translation then dates rather fast. There was a pioneer biblical translation in the 1950s, J.B. Phillips, whom I remember when I was a child being very popular. And he went so far in this functional equivalence direction that when St. Paul says, greet one another with a holy kiss, he renders it, have a hearty handshake all round, which somehow doesn't seem culturally right. Though actually, of course, it's what we've done with the peace, with the kiss of peace. We've turned it into a hearty handshake all round. And when you find friend go up higher in St. Luke's Gospel, Philip says, my dear fellow, we have a better seat for you than that, which you have to pronounce in sort of received pronunciation Southern English to get the full force of it. And it warns us that functional equivalence like that can date, but also can be rather marked with the translator's social class. And people complained about the New English Bible, that bits of it sounded as though it was written, as indeed it was, by academics in Oxford and Cambridge. And that isn't the impression you want to give, because nobody who wrote the New Testament was that. But there is a danger that you will give that impression. But the idea of this kind of translation is to produce the text the biblical writers might have written if they had been alive today and writing in English. whereas the formal equivalence, literal method, preserves a sense of distance and reminds us that the writers of the Bible weren't exactly like us. Now, and here I come to what I really wanted to say. Both approaches are making important points about the Bible. The point that the Bible is distant from us, and yet that the Bible needs to communicate with us in our own culture. But you can't have both things at the same time in a given translation. And that's why there can't be one perfect translation. Most translators tend to favor one method or the other, and there's an often rather ill-tempered debate between supporters of the two approaches, not only in the church and in Bible translation, but among translators in general. And it's bedeviled on both sides by two assumptions. One is that the approach a particular translator prefers isn't just correct, but is obviously correct, so that only an idiot would support the other way of doing things. And that is said by people on both sides of the divide. And the other assumption is that those in the opposing camp disrespect and distort the text. That those who prefer more literal translations see those who try to re-express the meaning in more natural English as wrongly modernizing the Bible, while those who believe that it needs modernizing suspect that the literalists are deliberately making it seem distant and alien, and so are getting in the way of readers seeing how relevant it is to their own lives. And these instinctive or temperamental reactions often lie at the heart of our preference for this or that version. And if you feel very strongly that you want the Bible to sound as King James does, or if you feel very strongly that you want it to sound like a modern version, it's worth asking yourself, how far is that a real preference and how far is it just temperamental, and you happen to veer one or the other naturally and can't help it, but you could perhaps see what the people on the other side are trying to say. Readers who prefer less literal translations, like the Jerusalem Bible, which Catholic churches have used for many years, often ridicule those who like formal equivalence versions like King James. They argue that for modern times, of course we need a modern Bible that speaks our language. Nobody nowadays talks like the King James Bible, so it's obvious that a less literal translation is better, even if the wording is further from the original Hebrew or Greek. The point, after all, is to convey the essential meaning, they say. We translate the Bible to communicate the gospel, not to support the study of Jacobean English. And this approach is particularly applicable to translations for people in non-Western cultures. For example, the book of Revelation contains the line in which the Lord says, "I stand at the door and knock." Now, if you are translating for a culture which has no doors and no locks, that might not convey anything really if you do it literally. But if you said, "I stand at the threshold and call," people might understand what it means. Now, it doesn't literally mean that, but that conveys the overall sense of the original in English or whatever language that the people hearing it actually understand. Not to make this kind of adjustment disrespects the target audience by producing a text they're not going to understand. Again, you can go too far. Already in the 18th century, there was a translation made for the Philippines, and this point was taken so far that the translator realized that figs were unknown there, and so every reference to figs in the New Testament was translated bananas. And that produces a text which to most of us will sound very comic, but probably worked in its own context. But the incident of the cursing of the banana tree isn't known to most of us. And of course, if you were then making a concordance of all the words in the Bible, there would be an entry for bananas, which would be very misleading. Now, both ways of translating are defended on moral grounds. Each is a matter of faithfulness, either faithfulness to the reader or faithfulness to the text. So the stakes are high and people get cross. And as I've said, I believe both approaches have their merits, but that neither is obviously and exclusively convincing, and you can't do both in one translation. I'd like to see them as equally valid under different circumstances. A good, quite loose translation is useful with people who don't have English as a first language, or perhaps with children. That could be, on the other hand, a bad translation for reading in cathedral evensong. Though there, of course, the shock effect could be a useful thing and worth experimenting with, but in principle, they belong in different contexts. And in general, actually, there are very few bad translations of the Bible on the market, because the linguistic skill of most Bible translators is very high. But some may be more appropriate to some contexts than others, which is another matter. Incompetent translation of the Bible is very rare, once we allow that both types are valid. Now, just one thing upsets this equality and balance, and it's this. As I've tried to say, the King James Bible, and actually also modern revisions of it, like the New Revised Standard Version, clearly lean towards being literal or formal equivalent. They stick closely to the original wording, and they don't rewrite passages by starting by asking, how would this content be expressed in modern colloquial English? And consequently, the Hebrew and Greek show through the English, producing biblical English, as we call it. English that you can see is a translation from Hebrew or Greek. So they seem to fall clearly on the more literal and conservative side of the divide I was describing. But this is mitigated in one important way, and this is the reason why the English tradition of Bible translation, as seen in the King James, has a special place amid all the chaotic variety of different translations. In translating the biblical texts from Hebrew and Greek into English, the translation had such a powerful effect that it actually changed the target language, the English style. Its literal way of rendering Hebrew, especially, generated a way of telling stories in English with one event succeeding another with no analysis, but just and then, and then, and then, which became a sort of special way of writing stories in English. And the English was therefore affected by the fact that there was a translation of Hebrew in English now. So the Hebrew Bible actually changed the English language in a way. The English Bible, by being rather literal, forged a new kind of English that came to sound as natural as if English had always been that way. The translator didn't so much integrate the Bible into an existing way of writing English as modify English to fit the Bible, thus creating a new kind of English. And this is something only really great translations are capable of doing in any language. The King James Version certainly brought the reader to the text in the sense of making the reader see that the text is a bit alien. It's demanding, the King James Bible. It doesn't feel like everyday speech, as does, for example, the Jerusalem Bible. And yet it managed to make a style of English that mimicked Hebrew or Greek sound implausibly as if it was a quite natural way for the English language to operate, and to such a degree that Hebrew constructions and idioms didn't any longer sound strange in English ears. Luther did the same thing in German, actually, so that among German speakers too, the language of the Bible partly became the language of everyday life. All those sentences in the Old Testament that begin with and, just as in the Hebrew, and strange expressions like stiff-necked for stubborn and hard-hearted for mean have passed into English usage, and so they're now idiomatic English after all, though they started as translations of the Hebrew. And this upsets the simple contrast between our two symmetrical approaches, and it means that formal equivalence, a degree of being literal, is entrenched in our expectations of Bible translations. And it results in a widespread dislike in many churches are Bibles that tend to paraphrase, like the New English Bible or the Jerusalem Bible. And this is often felt especially by people with a literary background. And some clergy, I'm afraid, mock it and regard it as obscurantist and old-fashioned and will have nothing to do with it. And that's because they've not seen that it's one valid way of translating the Bible, though there is another one which we've also looked at. Personally, I would defend almost any Bible now on the market as appropriate in some context, even including very paraphrastic ones like the Message, but also including, needless to say, the version commissioned by King James. Well, I'm about to draw to a close, but I want to finish with just a small reminder of something that is sometimes not noticed. The translators themselves, in their introduction to the King James Bible, stress that the Bible they were producing was in many ways not the beginning of a process, as though there'd been no Bible in English till then, rather the end, or better, the culmination of a process. What so greatly affected the development of the English language, as I've just been trying to say, was not actually the King James Version as such, but the Bible in English, going back to William Tyndale's translation in 1526, which in many ways created this wonderful hybrid between ordinary English and adopted Hebrew style that gave English Bibles their characteristic flavour. This tradition persisted through versions such as Miles Coverdale's, which gives us the translation of the Psalms in the Book of Common Prayer. That, of course, isn't King James, that is Coverdale, an earlier translation. And it persists also in the Geneva Bible, which was probably the English version used by John Donne, George Herbert, William Shakespeare, and indeed by King James himself, who of course didn't use the King James Bible because it didn't yet exist. The version he commissioned scooped up what was best in all of these and used it, but didn't simply replace it. And C.S. Lewis made this point quite forcefully, showing that the Hebraizing, biblical Hebrew, we know, biblical English, that we know from the King James Version was already established before the King's translators went to work. They weren't innovating, they were developing a tradition that already went back more than a century. Though we talk, therefore, rather loosely of the influence of the King James Version on our language, we should really recognize it as part of a larger movement, though one that it definitively crowned, the best example of a tradition. It wasn't meant to be new and fresh, it was intended as a summing up of all that was best in versions that already existed. And the translators themselves make just that point in their preface, where they say this: "Truly, good Christian reader, we never thought from the beginning that we should need to make a new translation, nor yet to make of a bad one a good one, but to make a good one better, or out of many good ones, one principal good one, not justly to be accepted against. That hath been our endeavour, that our mark." The King James Bible wasn't made from scratch. Hardly any English Bible ever has been. When we think we're making a new version, phrases from earlier ones ring in our ears, so that even at our most creative, we seldom do more than combine and occasionally correct the best of previous translations. That was King James's aim in commissioning the Bible that bears his name, together with an eye to bringing reconciliation to disputes in church and state. Many people at the time insisted on particular translations of words that at that time were contentious, such as bishop, penitence, and charity, which were regarded as rather Catholic words, and there were Protestant ones that were preferable. It doesn't really occur, that problem, for us now. But James wanted to produce a version that was somehow acceptable to all, though of course also acceptable to himself. And this was an unattainable goal then, just as it would be now, but that was the intention, to use translating the Bible as a means of building bridges over troubled waters. In the process, rather as a side effect of recruiting panels of translators of amazing skill in language, he succeeded in helping to create a masterpiece of English literature. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I'm not going to go on now eulogizing, because I know that someone else is going to give a vote of thanks, and I know people would love to have a chance to ask some questions. So if we may, we'll just move straight into the questions now. Yes, if you stand up, please, and speak as loudly as possible. I'm happy to repeat it.
Right, I was wondering, are you prepared to make a moral judgment and say that when the translation was made, that it elevated English language? Are you prepared to say that it elevated English language? And if so, is that a pattern that we could say applied to any language? That in every language where the Bible has been translated, it has elevated the language, it has elevated the target language.
Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that. Yeah.
You could, or could.
I couldn't hear it.
No, right. The question is, would you say that the King James Bible, in the process of translating, elevated the Christian, the English language, in the same way that the same thing would happen when the translation was made into other languages? I think that's the question. Yeah.
Well, I think there is some truth in that. Two levels. First of all, that sometimes it actually produces English, which is more distinguished than the original Hebrew or Greek in some ways. I mean, in that sense, it does what Dr. Johnson says the translator shouldn't do, and improves on the original. There are passages in St. Paul where the rhythms and the whole feel of the verses is absolutely sublime English, where the original Greek is just a perfectly good piece of Greek, but in a sense the translator improved it. But on the other hand, it's also true, I think, that in many languages, having a Bible in that language is felt to affirm the language. For example, a new Bible in Slovenian came out 20 or so years ago, and there was an enormous conference in Ljubljana celebrating this, not because people in Slovenia could now read the Bible and they couldn't before, but that because this new translation to Slovenian somehow showed what marvelous language Slovenian was, that in it you could read the Bible. And I think, I mean, nowadays, some people who produce the recent or not so recent revision of the Welsh Bible had a feeling that they were serving not just the Bible, but also the Welsh language by doing that. They were affirming that the Bible, that the Welsh language deserved to have a really good new Bible. And I think translators often do feel that about whatever language they're translating into, especially if perhaps that language doesn't have a tradition of lots and lots of versions as we do in English.
Thank you. Would you?
Would one get back to the Hebrew if one took the English and put it into Hebrew? If we did a reverse system.
Did you hear that, John?
I'm sorry, I can't hear the words.
No. I think I've understood that. Yes, but the notion is, would you get back if you do it in reverse and translate the King James version as we have it? Would you then get back to the Hebrew?
Well, you'd get somewhere near the Hebrew. I mean, doing that is a technical term, retroversion, which you find sometimes, where you have a passage missing from an ancient text, and you say, well, from the translation that exists, I can reconstruct what it must have said. Often, of course, there might be 2 or 3 words that would translate any given word in the English, and you don't know which was there. But you'd get, if you took a piece of modern, a piece of the King James Bible, and you had good Hebrew, you would get somewhere quite near the original. In fact, when I was learning Hebrew, we had to do Hebrew prose composition, in which we were given a piece of English and told to translate it into biblical Hebrew, and it's very difficult to know whether you've got it right or not, really. But we were often given a piece of the Apocrypha of a book which was written in Greek and doesn't exist in Hebrew, and asked to produce the Hebrew that would have been there if it had been written in Hebrew, because it's sort of biblical Greek and biblical English translated into biblical Hebrew. But if you took the New English Bible or the Jerusalem Bible, you would be very hard put to it to reconstruct the original, because they are much looser, and they try and find a way of summarizing what the real core meaning of the passage was, but not worrying about the individual words as such. So you wouldn't be able to do it there. That's one of the problems. Back translation always has that difficulty.
Nick,
Could you say something about rhythm? Obviously, the Psalms are a particular case.
Yeah.
I remember when David Scott, the poet, was working on the draft translation of the Psalms for common worship.
Yeah.
He brought a poet's ear to the translation. And could you just reflect a little bit on rhythm and King James Version?
Yes. Well, I mean, one of the things about, this isn't true of the New Testament in its version of Greek, but it's true of the Old Testament with Hebrew, and especially of the Psalms, that the lucky thing, as it were, for English speakers is that the things that mark out Hebrew poetry as poetry are reasonably translatable. If you think of trying to translate rhyming verse from one language into another, that's very, very difficult, because the rhyme is and the rhythm is what makes it poetry. But in Hebrew, the way you do verse is mainly you have lines with about 3 stresses in, but there are other syllables that kind of don't count. So you have 3 main beats, as it were, and then another line of 3 beats, or sometimes of 2 beats, matching the first one. And you don't have any rhymes on the whole, or sort of playing around with the words themselves. And that can be captured in English reasonably well, really, because we can do that kind of rhythmic thing. Much harder to capture in language like French, where you don't have lots of stresses in the middle of sentences, but things go along rather on one note and then they go down. And it's harder. But in English, you can do it. And there are lots of versions that do. And the King James Psalter and any Coverdale that we use in the prayer book is very good at capturing that sense of various stresses in the sentence. So the rhythm comes across. It also comes across in something like the Grail Psalter, which is the one that Roman Catholics mostly use in worship. And there again, it's in modern English, but it captures that sense of rhythm that you get in the original. So I think it is something, and King James certainly captures it very well. And that's why so much of the King James Bible is so memorable. The rhythms are all right. And great stylists in English can do that, and most other people can't. And we're just lucky that the translation panels or companies, as they were known, had so many people on that could do it. With modern Bibles, you tend to find that first of all, you let the linguists loose and they produce a kind of rough translation, and then a literary person comes along and tries to poeticize it. And that doesn't always work. You really need somebody who can do both at the same time. But such people are quite rare.
Right at the back there, Jeff.
I'd just like to ask to what extent discoveries of manuscripts since the publication of the King James Version have either proved its accuracy or inaccuracy.
Can you hear that?
I know, I'm sorry, I just can't catch.
Yes, the question is that what impact have discoveries of other manuscripts since the writing of the King James, the translation of the King James Bible? What impact would they have had upon, our understanding of it?
Sure. Yeah. Well, there have been quite a number of manuscript discoveries, and the main one that most people have heard of is the Dead Sea Scrolls, which started being discovered at a community around the Red Sea Dead Sea in the late 1940s. All the ones that have been discovered are now available in English in a Penguin translation, and you can read them. And some of them are actually texts of the Bible. So some of them are texts belonging to the community that produced them, but some of them are manuscripts of biblical books. But they have differences from the versions we know. The kind of Bibles that everybody used until then, the earliest complete Hebrew Bible comes from around about 1000 AD. So 1,000 years after the Bible finished being written. Whereas the Dead Sea Scrolls come from the period when some of it was still being written, from the sort of New Testament period. And so people have examined them very, very carefully to see whether they affect the wording that we're familiar with. And some of them do in important but small scale ways. For example, the Great Scroll of Isaiah, which is in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, is definitely the same book of Isaiah that we know from later Hebrew manuscripts and that we have in our Old Testaments. But there are hundreds of places where there are small variations because, of course, a scribe copying by hand is bound to make slips from time to time. You can't avoid it. The other thing is that they sometimes turn out to have in them words where there was a word in the Hebrew that we didn't know the meaning of, and you then find it used in other contexts in one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and you can work out from that what it means, which you couldn't do before. So improvements in knowledge of the text in the sense of what's actually been written there, and improvements in the knowledge of the language because of discovering new words or words with new meanings have both happened since the King James translators were at work. And that's why modern translations are often translating actually a better version of the text than was available in the 17th century. Though it's important not to exaggerate that. They are the same books, but with some changes in. But sometimes where the King James Version is obscure, we now know what the text actually meant, which we didn't then. And sometimes when it's obscure, we still don't know what the text means. And you have to just try your best if you're producing a translation.
I think we probably have to draw it to a halt, but if I may be allowed just one question myself. When I was preparing for my examination in Oxford, we had a series. Had a set book was book of Daniel.
Mm-hmm.
We had a series of seminars with one of your predecessors,
Mm-hmm.
who actually went on to become the Dean of Christ Church. And he said to us at the beginning, I want you all to read the same translation.
Mm-hmm.
And the translation he chose was the Revised Version because he said it was the most literal. I'm just to give a bit of brighten the thing up. One person came along with the ignored this instruction and came along with the Jerusalem Bible, and he read out at this point. He said, ... text unclear at this point. So I think that Eric Heaton felt this was unsatisfactory, particularly in a cathedral. What would your comment be on his choice of the Revised Version?
The Revised Version has completely disappeared. When I was a student, which was when he was doing that, it was the set text for finals in theology in Oxford, but nowhere else in the known universe, as far as I know. It's a 19th century revision of the King James Version, and it has principles like, for example, if the same word occurs in Hebrew, then the same word will occur in English. Well, we know ourselves from our own language that sometimes you need a different word to say the same thing. And it produced a very stilted kind of English, but they insisted on this way of doing it. And it has all the archaism of King James, all the sort of turns of phrase and uses of eth endings and that kind of thing that that make King James seem distant, but none of the attractive style and rhythm and verve of King James. It's a very dull crib, really. It's like the kind of thing you write between the lines of a text so the person can understand it word by word as they go along. But it's never really been used very much in practice. So that was odd. But there was a revision of it, which is what is now called the Revised Standard Version, which was a very good revision, produced both in England and in America. And that, of course, is one that many people do still use. And the new Revised Standard Version, NRSV, which is printed in all the common worship service books, is therefore a revision of King James. But it still has the same way of going on, that it does it rather literally and word for word, but it avoids archaic turns of phrase. But it isn't a reconceptualization of the thing as the Jerusalem Bible or the New English Bible are. And that distinction, I think, is really the thing I'd like people to take away from what I've been saying, that there are two different ways of doing it. And the NRSV, which we tend to use officially in the Church of England, is still the old stick close to the original version or method, but it's more rests on more modern knowledge than King James did. But I don't think it does the rhythm and the style nearly as well as the King James translators did. So it's a bit lame. And if you hear it read in church on a Sunday, I'm sure you'll be aware of places where the NRSV falls flat, where King James doesn't.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to hand over now to Andrew Duker, but before, as I do so, I just hope that you've been sufficiently enthused and interested to go out and buy a copy of the Word. I don't get any commission to say.
But I do, so please do. my usual motto: please buy one and buy one for a friend as well.
Sit down here. No, that's right.
That leads very well into the first thing I need to say, ladies and gentlemen, and that is that there are copies to look at of Professor Barton's two most recent books, and they're in the church where you're invited to refreshments when you leave. And also, I was asked to just let you know that there are bowls at the back of the hall and in the church where you could make a donation to help cover the costs of this evening's event. But that's not really what I'm here to do. I was remembering when I was thinking about giving a word of thanks this evening, that a long time ago in my misspent youth, I wrote a letter to the Church Times. This was in 1980. At a time when a petition had been raised by the Prayer Book Society against at the time of the publication of the Alternative Service Book. I'm sure there are people here who will remember that great event in 1980. And the petition was signed by 600 very prominent people from the English establishment, and one or two from Scotland as well, but mainly from the English establishment, protesting that we were in danger of losing the King James version of the Bible and indeed the Book of Common Prayer. And I'm afraid that I had the temerity to argue with that and found myself several years later quoted in a book that was published by the Prayer Book Society called No Alternative, being told how very foolish I was. I have now repented, and therefore I do feel able to stand here and thank Professor Barton. First of all, with, I'm sure, total unanimity of everybody here, for actually even enabling this event to go ahead this evening in the circumstances that he and his wife are facing. And as Philip said at the beginning, we do offer our very best wishes to you for that. But much more than that, but an extraordinary survey of the challenges and the possibilities of translation of the Bible. I guess, particularly in the context of that petition back in 1980, a large number of us primarily encounter the Bible in the course of worship, And the debate still rages on about the place of, I suppose, the beauty of the language of 17th century English. I guess that there would be counter arguments, which Professor Barton has opened up very well about the need for the language of our faith to address where we are today, and sometimes that would be a little bit hidden in 17th century English. But I have certainly learned a huge amount about the complexities of translation, and I'm deeply grateful for that, and deeply grateful that we've had this opportunity to sit at the feet of a true expert on both the history of the Bible, but also the history of the translation of the Bible. And so I'm sure on behalf of us all, I would like to thank you very much indeed, Professor Barton, for giving us this lecture and your time.
Very much, thank you. Pleasure to be there, as I sort of am.
Could I also just also acknowledge and thank members of Berwick Parish Church, led by Philip Moore and indeed David Mason, who I know has put a lot of effort, they have all put a lot of effort in the last 3 days, particularly with the challenges of putting this event on, for their very hard work and enabling us all to enjoy this evening so much. So thank you very much for that as well.